Please turn in it. That was weird. To Romans chapter 9. This is where we're going to spend our time. This is going to be two sermons plugged together. And the reason is that one of them is a special request. So I had a special request from somebody to do a sermon on Romans 11. The problem is you can't really do Romans 11 unless you do Romans 9 because of the interlinkage. As a matter of fact, I would encourage everybody to, when at your leisure, go home and read 3 chapters, Romans 9, 10, and 11. Then you'll have a clear perspective on exactly what it is that God is using Paul to communicate to us as we look at this text. But one of the things about this particular text is it makes difficulties for us. One of those difficulties is when we're talking to other people about Jesus, this text seems to say something that makes talking about God rather uncomfortable because it says some things that are uncomfortable regarding God's character if we read it wrongly. The other is for the person ourselves, as we think about our own life with the Lord, if we find things in God's character that are troubling, then it becomes very difficult for us to be comfortable trusting God. So I want to take a look at this text because it says some uncomfortable things like that and to see if we can come to an understanding as to what Paul is communicating here. So it's Romans chapter 9. I'll begin reading in verse 14. He says, "What shall we say then? Is there injustice with God?" Paul says, absolutely not. God says to Moses, "I'll have mercy on whom I'll have mercy, and I'll have compassion on whom I'll have compassion." So then, it doesn't depend on human desire or human exertion, but on God who shows mercy. For the scripture says to Pharaoh, "For this very purpose I have raised you up, that I might demonstrate my power in you, and that my name might be proclaimed in all the earth." So then, God has mercy on whom he chooses to have mercy, and he hardens whom he chooses to harden. You'll say to me then, why does God then still find fault? Who has ever resisted God's will? It's a good question. Who indeed are you, a mere human being, to talk back to God this way? What is molded say to the molder, "Why have you made me like this?" Has the potter no right to make from the same lump of clay one vessel for special use and another vessel for ordinary use? But what if God, willing to demonstrate his wrath and to make known his power, has endured with much patience the objects of wrath prepared for destruction? And what if he's willing to make known the wealth of his glory on the objects of mercy that he's prepared beforehand for glory? Even us, whom he has called, not only from the Jews, but also from the Gentiles. As God says in Hosea, "I will call those who are not my people, my people. I will call her who was unloved, my beloved. And in every place where it was said to them, 'You are not my people,' they will be called the children of the living God." Isaiah cries out on behalf of Israel, "Though the number of the children of Israel are as the sand of the sea, only a remnant will be saved. For the Lord will execute his sentence on the earth completely and quickly," just as Isaiah predicted. If the Lord's armies had not left us with descendants, we would be like Sodom and we would have looked like Gomorrah. Now there's a ton here, and we can't possibly cover the whole thing in one sermon. I could probably do 3 or 4 here, and we could probably do a Bible study in Sunday school for several weeks over this very issue. But I do want to unpack some of the features here that look to say very uncomfortable things about God's character, because that's important, very important. Paul tells us something really important here. He says something that gets overlooked in this text, but it's a huge subject. He asks the question of the imaginary person to whom he speaks, "Is God unjust?" And then Paul answers his own question by saying absolutely not. That is a huge statement that if we don't capture it, we're not going to understand this text at all. When we speak of God, Let's think about God as a subject right now. When you speak of God, you are speaking of what would be called the supreme being. Does everybody understand that? The supreme being. Two words that we plug together, supreme and being. We know what beings are. You and I are beings. We understand that. We're thinking, we have desires, we have purposes, we have intentions. We're thinking, we're conscious beings. What does it mean then to say supreme? And stick those two things together. This is where Anselm in the 12th century came to the conclusion that when we talk this way, we are talking about a being greater than which none can be conceived. In other words, when we say supreme being, we're talking about a being that there's no way to think about a being that is greater than that being. And if you're thinking about a being greater than the supreme being, that's the supreme being. There can only be one when you use the word supreme. This is what's known in the philosophy of religion as ethical monotheism. There's one God, one supreme being, and that supreme being is good. You know why he's good? Because he can't be the supreme being if he's not. It's just that simple. That's what Paul means. Is God unjust? No, it's impossible. Absolutely not, he says. Now here's the problem. We look at things like justice. If one of you, let's just say that Harold today walks up here and slaps me, I would look at that as unjust. I would think, what are you doing? But there may be something in the history of humanity that makes that just. Or maybe on the spectrum between unjust and just, it falls somewhere in the middle. Because none of us knows the whole history of everything such that we can say that anything is absolutely just or absolutely unjust. We cannot know that. We have a limit. The limit is our lifetime. The limit is the lifetime of the history of the human race. So when we look at something, we say, oh, that's unjust. It's usually a bigger question than that. And we don't know all the answers. The supreme being does. That's what Paul is getting at here. If God exists, then there is a supreme being. And the supreme being knows what real justice is. So when the supreme being decides something is just, it's therefore just, even if we don't fully understand it. Now think about it in terms of the history of the Old Testament. You've got all of these people, starting with Abram all the way forward, who trusted God. Abraham said it himself, will not the maker of the universe do what is right? That's an excellent question. For the unbeliever, they look at what we're talking about here and they say, well, all of this is just arbitrary. You talk about justice with God. Well, you're just making a statement. You're just saying that God is just. Go back to what Paul has said here. You cannot talk about a supreme being and use those words and the supreme being not be just. It's not possible. You're talking about something else when you say that. If you say the supreme being is not just, you're not talking about the supreme being. So what this boils down to is, even if God doesn't exist, none of us can know what real justice is because we do not have all the facts. In anything, take anything, you name it, something happening politically today, something happening in the law today, something happening in a criminal behavior today. We cannot know what absolute justice is. Even if there is no God, we can't know it. But if there's a God, he does. He knows because he's got all the facts. It's really simple. It's a statement that in this text gets overlooked, but it's a gigantic statement. Can God be unjust? Absolutely not. And there's a historical context here that's really important. Paul uses Pharaoh as the example. That's a really good example. Pharaoh was not a believer. Not only was he not a believer, he was an intransigent unbeliever. That is, he's not going to be convinced no matter what. The Bible says Pharaoh hardened his heart. The Bible also says God hardened his heart. Now, Pharaoh, if you go back and look at the history of the Exodus and look at the history of Pharaoh's life as we have it in the Bible, Pharaoh saw a lot of stuff. He saw a lot. He saw all the plagues. He saw the last plague where all the firstborn died. He saw Moses performing these acts. He saw some stuff too with his own court magicians. You remember the court magicians did some pretty amazing things too. And the court magicians at one point, go back and read the text of the Exodus. You see the court magicians come up against one of these things and they say, we can't do anything about this. This is the finger of God. Now, if you're a court magician in Pharaoh's court, you don't say things like that, because that's the kind of thing that gets your head taken off. You don't say things to the Pharaoh that he doesn't agree with or he doesn't think are true. They took a huge chance when they said that. Why did they do it? Because it was really true. These things were happening and they had no control over them. Pharaoh's heart became hardened. Pharaoh hardened his heart. God hardened his heart. But at any point in the whole story, Pharaoh could have relented. That choice was always open to him. He could have said, God is God, and I give in. But he didn't. You know, that's a universal option available for every human being to say, I give up. You're God and I'm not. Israel, as a nation, they had reasons to believe. Look at all they got to see from Abraham forward. What did they get to see? Miracles. They got to see themselves adopted as God's children. They got to see the pillar of fire during the day and the pillar of fire at night and the pillar of smoke during the day. They got to see the thunder and lightning show on top of Mount Sinai. They got to see the Red Sea parted. They got to see the plagues. They got to see themselves preserved from the plagues. They saw the covenants given to them. They had the codified law that Moses came down from the top of the mountain with, and they had the promise of a Messiah who would come. They had all these prophets telling them things that all came true. They saw a lot. And they saw all of that. And yet, when you look at the history of Israel, they were wayward. Think about what that means for you and me who've seen none of those things. This Old Testament comparison that Paul makes is so critical to understanding this text. Let me give you an example, a couple of them. Number one is Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar was Pharaoh. He was just like Pharaoh. He didn't believe. He walked out on his veranda one morning and looked across his vast kingdom. And he said, look at what I've done. I am a great king. And God heard that. And God said, okay, I'll show you something. Let me show you something. And he became like a wild animal, lost his mind, lived in the wilderness like a wild animal, and not just for a couple of days, but for a long time. Nebuchadnezzar then was sifted just like Pharaoh was sifted. Pharaoh was sifted. He saw all that stuff in front of him. Pharaoh's heart became hard. God hardened his heart. Pharaoh hardened his heart. But Pharaoh could have been like Nebuchadnezzar and said, I give up. Nebuchadnezzar gave up. He came back and he said, you're God and I'm not. The reason I have this kingdom is because you're God and you've given it to me. I didn't do all this. So you can see where mercy is always available for anybody. I don't care how they are, how bad they are, how hardened they are, how far away from God they are. That choice to take God's offer of mercy is always available for anybody. Think about it this way. I mean, and here's what makes this difficult, is that God has chosen, because he's God, to always honor yours and my individual sovereignty as an individual. He honors that. He does not overcome us as individuals. Take the choice of Mary and Joseph. You remember a few weeks back, we looked at this. Joseph, there's poor Joe. His wife is pregnant, his betrothed, which in the Jewish culture meant you were practically married. And yet, Joe knows one thing, just like I know I didn't shoot John F. Kennedy. Joe knows that baby's not his. He knows that. He doesn't need anybody. He doesn't have to work it out in his head. You're not going to gaslight Joe into thinking that's his child. He knows it's not his child. And so he decides, I'll put Mary away privately and quietly. Why? Because he really loves her. And he doesn't want to see her brought to open shame. He doesn't want her stoned for adultery because, hey, she's pregnant and it's not mine. How'd that happen? But then God intervenes and God says to Joseph, don't be afraid to take her as your wife. The baby that lives in her was put there by the Spirit of God. I put that baby there. No man was involved. So you can take her as your wife. Joe then changes his mind. And he accepts the explanation and he moves on. Think about it in terms of Pharaoh. Pharaoh could have taken the examples that God gave him through Moses, and he could have changed his mind. He could have. Paul in this text, and again, I encourage you to read all three of these chapters, Paul in this very text mentions Esau and Jacob. Before they were ever born, Paul says, before they had ever done anything right or wrong, God chose Jacob. He simply made a choice. Now, think about Jacob and think about Pharaoh, think about Esau. In just looking at Esau and Pharaoh, does anything in this text tell us they were lost? No, not one word. This is where Calvin made his mistake. He assumed that because God chose one vessel for honor and another vessel for destruction, or even a vessel that would be an object of wrath like Pharaoh, that meant they were lost. The text doesn't say that anywhere. It's not there. Calvin thought it said that. And so we've got now the point at where people think God predestines certain people for heaven and certain people for hell, and there's nothing you can do about that. Calvin got this wrong here in this very text. He assumed that because there was a vessel designed for God's wrath, that meant eternally. It doesn't mean that. It doesn't mean that. What's the context of this passage? What is it really telling us? It is such a simple message. The message is God, the supreme being, chooses to use people for his purposes. That's the message. That's all there is to it. It's got nothing to do with who's going to heaven and who's going to hell. Not one word of this has anything to do with that. God chooses people to use them in specific ways to fit into his plan. How is it that God can do that? Well, it's because he owns everything. If God exists, he's the supreme being. If the supreme being exists, then everything apart from himself, he made. All the angels, all the cosmos, he owns it. And so if God decides that your life or mine has to fit into his plan in a certain way, he can do that because it all belongs to him. God used the evil of Pharaoh's hardened heart to do what? How many people have read the Exodus now over the millennia since the Exodus took place in the 14th century BC and have learned something about God from it? How many? Countless people. So God has used Pharaoh in countless lives to change their lives. God used the evil of the Jewish intelligentsia and the Romans to bring Jesus to the cross. Aren't you glad about that? I am. That's why Paul in this very text quotes Joel and says, anyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. That means anyone. It doesn't mean just somebody's. That means anyone. Nebuchadnezzar did it. Pharaoh could have done it. Maybe he did, and we don't know. We don't know. God is the author of life, and he can do with life what he chooses to do. That's why when Paul says, who are you to talk back to God? He's not saying that you and I shouldn't question God. David did. Go read the Psalms and tell me that questions aren't coming. David asked a lot of questions. He challenged God in lots of ways. So did Job. That's not what Paul is saying. Paul is saying, in the end, God owns everything. You can ask your questions, but you may not get an answer. You see, it all boils down to one thing. All one thing. All the way through the history of humans' interaction with God, there are only two choices. Two choices. One is you trust him, the other is you don't. And that's it. That's what this text is giving to us. It's saying to us, Pharaoh chose not to trust God, period. And so God hardened his heart. Why not? He was a vessel for destruction. Doesn't mean he didn't come to God eventually. We don't know. There are vessels of destruction that get saved. There are. There are vessels created for honor and glory that get saved. There are vessels created for honor that don't get saved. They never come to Jesus. The distinction here is nothing more than God is using people within his plan. And the possibility for any of those being used to surrender to him is always open. Jesus says, I stand at the door and knock. He doesn't say I stand at it with a .38 revolver and I'll shoot the lock off if you don't let me in. I'll knock, and if you will turn the handle, I will come in. God uses the earthly birth, the lowly life, the hard, high moral example of Jesus, the brutal death, and the resurrection to open us up and to show us that there is a door we can't open. How will God use you and me? Will we harden our heart or will we bend our knee? That's the question Paul is asking here today. I don't know where everybody is, but if I've said anything about which you've got